Okay, thank you for coming to today's event. My name is Sahashi, Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo. Today, we have Security Studies Unit Forum, the rise of the Chinese techno-security state under Xi Jinping. We are really delighted to have Professor Cheung from University of California, San Diego, in person to the University of Tokyo Hongo campus. So thank you very much for coming, Professor Cheung, to here. And also we have excellent discussant, Professor Jinping from Aoyama Gakuin University. And this is also our pleasure to have him again today to this event. So today's event is about Chinese techno-security transformation process, which is now under Xi Jinping regime. And Professor Cheung, in front of me, Professor Cheung just published his new book. The title is Innovate to Dominate, from Cornell University Press. So today's talk will be based on this just incoming book. So this is really educative forum, I believe. Just before going, let me just introduce Professor Cheung. Professor Cheung completed his PhD in war studies at King's College, University of London. And he is a professor specializing on China, security and innovation matters at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. He is also the director of the University of California-wide Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, which is really famous institute. And also let me introduce Professor Jinping. He's professor at Aoyama Gakuin University, and he completed his PhD in political science at the University of Tokyo. And also he pursued his doctoral studies at New York University. He is currently professor at Aoyama Gakuin University, and he specializes in contemporary Chinese politics, with a particular interest in elite politics and foreign security policy in PRC. So today's event will take place until 5:40. So, and our game plan is, so from now, 30 minutes, we have a keynote speech from Professor Cheung and 10 minutes discussion from Professor Lim. And then Professor Cheung will respond to Professor Im's comment, about 5 to 7 minutes, and then I will open this floor to you. And today we have, I think, over 300 audience from all over the world, I believe. So you may have many questions. So please try not to waste your time. So please make your question and please post your question to Q&A for today's event, and I will pick up your questions. So without any further ado, I want to pass this microphone to Professor Cheung.
Thank you very much, Rio. It's been it's a delight to be back in person in Tokyo, despite the super typhoon. So my last memories of Tokyo was dry and sunny, and now I will go back with it being wet and wet and breezy. Okay. But I wanted to spend the next 30 minutes or so to talk about this issue, which is at the center of the research and the book that I've done itself, which is about the techno-security state. So the book is a result of about 15 years of research. And I have to apologize if anyone does buy my book, as there's more footnotes than there is actual text itself, which is a sign of poor book management on my part itself. But it's but unfortunately, as I tell all my people who buy my book, that I can't give you any refunds. So it's so that's the only apology I will give. So the topic is about the nature of the Chinese state in the security technology and development domain that has taken place sort of over the last 10 years, essentially since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. There's been sort of a lot of change during this period of time, especially on the security and the technology developments itself. And the way I characterize what's been going on is the rise of this techno-security state. And the techno-security state, both as it refers to China, but a more general concept, is that it's what we call sort of a security maximizing, sort of like innovation focused state, where it's like the state is focused on building its power and its prestige upon sort of a security and technological foundation. And Xi Jinping has very much put sort of like innovation, security, both national security and military security, at sort of the very top of his priorities. And sort of it's been clear, especially in the last few years, that that's been the case. But when he came to power in 2012, it was a puzzle why he did this, because when you look at the trajectory of China's development, especially sort of like over the last 40 years, it's always been economic development. From Deng Xiaoping with the reform and open door period through to his successors from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, the emphasis was on economic development. And when Xi Jinping came to power, most commentators sort of expected more of the same, because China was growing very, very strongly. It was sort of like to use the sort of like the maxim that the Deng Xiaoping focused on in terms of his grand strategy, sort of keeping a low profile and biding their time, so the economic development. But in the book and the comments I'll talk about is like this changed quite quickly itself, and now sort of like provide a number of reasons. Essentially, sort of like what I see in terms of the nature of the techno-security state can be defined sort of like in 5 key components itself. And I'll go through some of them itself. A national security strategy, an innovation-driven development strategy, the notion of military strengthening in the new era, military-civil fusion, and more recently, the notion of economic securitization. These are the 5 components that makes up the techno-security state. And in the book, I trace this to sort of a lot of plans and development strategies and sort of like and leadership strategic visions that you can sort of like chart in this table. And as I see Rio squinting, I've made it so that you can actually see it, making it so, but at least there's bright colors in the chart. But there's things like the Made in China 2025, or the 5-year plans, or a range of other sort of like strategic development or innovation development plans. You can sort of trace a lot of this plans to what's been pursued by the Xi Jinping regime over these 10 years. And I'll go through some of them. So to begin these 5 components, the first one, that's a key part, that's one of the key anchors to the techno-security state, is the security part itself. And I would say that sort of China under Xi Jinping is also a national security state. That the security has become as important, if not more important, than development. And this is sort of like this equation between sort of development and security is a theme that Xi Jinping talks about in a lot of his sort of leadership speeches. It's like he said, it's like development and security go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And this was sort of like under his predecessors. It was, as I said, it was development was primary and security was more secondary. So what we've seen is an adjustment of this. And I would actually say that security, especially in the last few years, has become even more important than development. But it's making that balance. And the issue also is, what does it mean by security or national security? And I would say that Xi Jinping has a very different view of what national security is compared to his predecessors. I mean, if you look at Chinese regimes before 2012, national security in general was sort of like much more what sort of in international relations we would see as a neo-realist perspective, right? It was about sort of like the nature of the international system, sort of like, and the threats and sort of power configurations and how that impacts upon a country's security. And so this was a very sort of traditional, conventional way, the balance of power and those types of issues. And that's what in defense white papers, sort of like in international assessments, that's been the traditional approach to how China saw national security. But under Xi Jinping, he redefined what national security was. He sort of sees it in much more political and ideological terms itself. It's like the neo-realist dimension is important, but a lot of the domestic foundations, a lot of sort of like the ideological dimensions has become even more important. And sort of like in sort of like the national security vision that Xi Jinping put forward, what he calls a holistic national security concept. He talks about issues as people security, political security. And what this really means to me is that national security is defined as maintaining the hold on to power and sort of like, and increasingly tightening that hold on power of the Communist Party. It's the Communist Party as the dominant sort of component of sort of like this holistic security. And so one useful anecdote is that shortly after Xi Jinping comes to power, he talks about the importance of learning sort of like lessons from the recent past and why sort of China's security is in these political terms. And one of the lessons that he points to is the downfall of the Soviet Union. Sort of like he gives some speeches about sort of like historical nihilism, and it's like one of the things that we must learn from the Soviet Union is in terms of these political struggles that leads to sort of undermining of the ruling regime. And if we don't deal with that in security terms, then China's overall national security will be very much jeopardized. And so from the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's sort of this narrative of these threats to sort of a regime security from color revolutions, from Arab Springs, etc. And it's and so this approach to national security, sort of Xi Jinping defines it in sort of these very non-traditional terms, from political security, sort of to emerging threats, etc. But also security for Xi Jinping is not just about sort of like sort of the political threats, but he also says it's about the containment of China's rise. So that's another way that sort of like the West in particular is containing China from rising to its rightful place, etc. So when you put all this together, it's the regime since 2012 has very much sort of seen that both the domestic and the international environments, and they're increasingly seen to be very interrelated, is a major source of challenge and threats to China itself. And so that national security perspective has become even more severe. Sort of the threats, this zero-sum view of the world has become even more threatening over the last few years. And in the last 5 years, sort of like with the advent of great power competition, etc., China has actually intensified its views that its security is under growing challenge. So from there, you can see that sort of one component of the Techno-Security, the national security part, is pushing a lot of pressure, then the need to rise up to an increasingly severe threat environment. And so to respond to that itself, China is looking to strengthen its military, its strategic, it's water geostrategic and geo-economic capabilities. Another key component is the notion of military strengthening in the new era. And Xi Jinping emphasizes the importance of strengthening, right? Which is one of the complaints that Xi Jinping has when he comes to power is that China and the Chinese military, they are very big. I mean, the People's Liberation Army has one of the largest manpower strengths with lots of equipment, but he complains that it's not strong. And so how can you make China and the Chinese military not just being big, but being strong? And the key way you do that is through innovation. Innovation broadly defined. Technological innovation, which is important, but also organizational, also doctrinal, strategic, etc. All these different elements. And this innovation, both on the military side, but also at the national side, is a very, very core component. And so what we've seen in recent years is this effort to transform the nature of the PLA, major organizational reforms since the mid-2010s. A lot of revamping of the technological pipeline so that you have new generations of equipment, but also it's a lot of new thinking. And I suspect with the war in Ukraine, there's going to be a lot more thinking about how the PLA deals with the nature of warfare, because up until February of this year, the PLA had this very clear insight of what the next war would be like, very high tech, very informationalized, what they call intelligence-analyzed. But the Ukraine war has thrown up a lot of issues that they may have overlooked, much more simple issues such as morale, manpower type issues, logistics that they may have paid less attention to. So, and there's been and the PLA and Xi Jinping has given the PLA a clear timeline that over the next 10, 20 years, the PLA will reach certain targets itself. So there's a clear strategic vision. And at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, the goal was that by 2035, the PLA would basically achieve its defense modernization. So it will become a first tier military power. And by mid-century, or the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, that the PLA will begin to challenge for being the strongest military in the world, which is essentially to challenge the US. In the last year, some of these timelines have been pushed even more quickly. In the 14th five-year plan that came out in the spring of 2021, there was a new timeline that by 2027, which is 8 years before the 2035, that it was said that the PLA should develop strategic capabilities to deter in the Indo-Pacific, which some people take to mean is to deal with the situation in the Taiwan Straits, or in some of the other maritime contested domains. A third component that links military strengthening to the broader national economy is this notion of military civil fusion, what the Chinese call the Juminronghe approach, which is how you can integrate the civilian and the defense portions of the Chinese economy into this this dual use system. And this this has very much become a lightning rod of concern in the US and in the West, because people see that sort of like a key part, some of the key engines of Chinese innovation is in the private sector, with companies, whether it's Alibaba or Huawei or sort of like sort of all these private sector firms sort of providing sort of like sort of cutting edge, sort of globally sourced innovation that the Chinese military and the defense establishment can pull into sort of the Chinese system. The problem, though, is that although Xi Jinping personally has sort of taken sort of leadership of military system of fusion, the Chinese sort of economic and industrial systems are very poorly organized to allow for civil military integration. The Chinese economy is very much compartmentalized. And even if sort of the leaders, the military or civilian elite leaders, wanted to be able to source a lot of this civilian commercial capabilities and put it into the military, they lack the institutional mechanisms to make that happen. And in my book, I look at things like the acquisition system, which is critical for a military to be able to sort of like acquire and sort of like and make use of the technologies around. And if you don't have a sort of a modern, well-developed acquisition system, all the political wishes you want cannot be made to happen, because it's the bureaucrats, it's the program managers that sort of like decide at the end of the day. And the Chinese have a very underdeveloped acquisition system. So like I would be sort of in my book, I'm quite sort of like careful to say, it's like, well, there's a lot of talk about military civil fusion, but the reality is very, very different. And then I was sort of want to turn more recently. There's been also this turn towards economic securitization. So a lot of sort of like these early parts that I talked about, sort of military strengthening, the national security state, sort of military civil fusion, that's about sort of like a relatively small part of the Chinese economy. In the book, I estimate about 6 to 7% of the Chinese economy is what we would define as the techno-security state. But it's like, so there's the vast majority of the Chinese economy has not very close or any ties with the techno-security state. But more recently, there's been this effort that the Chinese authorities are worried that as sort of like efforts by the US and the West to try to decouple, try to put export controls, sanctions, and other types of restrictions on China, that China needs to significantly protect and build up sort of like major parts of the Chinese economy, whether it's supply chains or technological self-reliance, etc. And so what we're seeing is this effort to focus on economic security. I mean, economic security has traditionally been a concept that the Chinese authorities have used, but economic security until the last few years have been sort of focused on what we call the micro sectoral foundations of the Chinese economy. It would be on food security, for example, or energy security, etc. Very sort of like specific parts of the Chinese economy. But in the last 2 to 3 years, there's been an effort to what I would define as sort of like have economic securitization to secure the macro foundations of the Chinese economy, about supply chains, about sort of like technology more broadly, whether it's in semiconductors or in these other areas. And when you look at sort of the macro securitization of the Chinese economy, then it becomes much bigger, so that the reach of the techno-security state then is sort of like the footprint is significant, much more significant than just a techno-security state. But this is still in the early stages, and this is the focus of my next book. So, lastly, it's I mean, I also have sort of like spent a chapter to look at its a lot of what I've talked about is sort of fairly broad at the fairly strategic level, but it's like, how does China actually operationalize its innovation system for techno-security development? And so I spend some time looking at the institutional implementation of the techno-security state. And what I come up with, as we academics, we like acronyms and long words. The Chinese system has developed what we call a selective authoritarian mobilization and innovation model. This model has its roots all the way back to the 1950s and 60s, when the Chinese regime at that time developed their strategic weapons capabilities, its nuclear weapons, its ballistic missiles. This is what the Chinese used to call, or they still call it, the 2 bombs and 1 satellite philosophy. That it's like to be able to do these big science, these big engineering programs, you need to leverage the core characteristics of the Chinese socialist system. And Xi Jinping says those lessons apply to today. And in his speeches, he talks about the superiority of the Chinese social system that allows China to be able to be very successful in these strategic innovation programs, whether it's the manned space program, or it's high performance computing, it's or a lot of these cutting edge emerging capabilities. And the reason why I call it the selective authoritarian mobilization model is that this describes the key characteristics of what this SAMI model has been quite successful. One is that it's selective, which means that the Chinese authorities have to be very, very careful. It does a few things really, really well, and it doesn't spread itself too thin. So when you look at some of these strategic technology development plans, such as the medium and long-term science and technology development plans, it's about, they have about 15 to 16 programs. And if you look so it's just these handful of areas. A second one is the authoritarian nature of the system, is that it's very much of a top-down approach. I mean, the leader who's in charge of the selective authoritarian mobilization model is Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping very much is engaged in overseeing a number of key projects, etc., which is amazing when you look at that. Xi Jinping is his label is the chairman of everything. So how can he also focus on these projects while he's trying to run the country itself? But science and technology and strategic weapons programs are something that Xi Jinping pays a lot of attention to. And the third characteristic is this mobilization system. Once you've selected what your key areas are, and once you have the top leadership very much engaged in that, you're able to mobilize whatever resources within the Chinese system to focus on these areas, etc. And so when you put all these together, then you can be you tend to be quite successful. The question going forwards, and this is the fourth part of the model, is what kind of innovation are we talking about? And there's 2 types of innovation that I would say that the Chinese techno-security state is involved in. One has been the focus for China's technology development, both on the civilian as well as the defense and strategic side, for the last 30 to 40 years, is what the Chinese call re-innovation, right? Or what in the West we call an absorption-based approach to innovation, where the Japanese have done this very well, where the innovation is around the world. You bring that in, you absorb that, and you reverse engineer, and you improve upon that. The Chinese have done this on a whole range of areas. Perhaps the best example is high-speed trains, where a lot of the knowledge and technologies came from elsewhere, but China absorbed that, and they improved upon that. And that re-innovation, which is sort of what catch-up countries do, the Chinese have done really, really well. But you're still, from that motto, you still are a follower. What Xi Jinping is emphasizing, especially in the last few years, is that China really does well on re-innovation, or what I call the SAMIA model. But what China needs to do now is to go above that to original innovation, to sort of like sort of a discovery-based model, which is what advanced sort of like high-end countries like the US and sort of another OECD countries do. Is that you need to have sort of like new research and development from your own country and use that to sort of like to get ahead to the global frontier. This is what I call the SAMI-B model, and Xi Jinping is really sort of like emphasizing that. There's a sort of like in the 14th five-year plan, in the new 2021 to 2035 sort of medium and long-term science and technology development, there's a lot of focus upon original innovation. Sort of like so we're seeing a lot of sort of like restructuring of the research and development and innovation systems, like revamping of universities, of national laboratories, and a whole range of different areas itself. And sort of the shift from the SAMI-A, the re-innovation, to the SAMI-B, to the original innovation. This is going to be critical if China is going to be able to sort of meet its goal of becoming sort of like, or challenging to become the dominant power itself. And I would say that it's by no means sort of clear cut that China is going to succeed in this. I mean, it's like what we're in is these are really, really difficult issues, and China has a lot of strengths, but it has a lot of weaknesses. And by the time you finish reading my book, you'll probably be even more confused than enlightened. So unfortunately, that's usually the case with my research. It helps to confuse people, but at least you get a lot of footnotes as part of that process. And on that, I'll end it here.